Welcome back. This morning we're going to be talking about the little book of Haggai. Haggai is written about 100 years or so after the book of Zephaniah. At this point, the southern kingdom has been taken into captivity by the Babylonians in 586, 587 BC. Now, in 538, King Cyrus has released the Jewish captives who want to go home to return to the Promised Land. And now, they're almost 18 years after that decree. Some have returned home, and things haven't quite yet returned to normal. And so Haggai really is a book of promise, a book of reminding the people of God what God has promised, as well as what is our covenantal obligation to Him. The people have returned to the Promised Land, those who are going to return, and many don't. Others will return in multiple waves, all the way up into the year 450 BC, 70 years after this. But the ones who have returned haven't quite returned to normal. In fact, what we discover when we read the book of Zechariah, written about the same time, is that what the people did was they returned to their old way of lives, negatively speaking, as often as they did positively. The symbol in the book of Haggai is the temple. When they return to Jerusalem, what they've discovered is the temple has been completely, utterly, totally destroyed. Now remember, the temple is not only the place where you go to make your sacrifices, but in doing so, it is symbolic of the place where one goes to encounter to meet God. It's where you go to restore the relationship. It's where you go to restore, to redeem your soul from the sins you've committed in the meantime. But with the temple being destroyed, it's symbolic of the relationship of the people with God. Their relationship is broken at best, non-existent at worst. And what we discover is when they return, they don't do much to fix either one right away. The book of Haggai is really a series of 4 messages written over the span of about 4 months. Haggai speaks, deals with a problem, comes back a few months later, deals with another thing. But through it out, he has one constant theme for all these messages. And that theme is very simply put, real faith changes everything. If you really believe it, it changes what you do. It's my mantra, orthodoxy, right thinking, produces orthopraxy, right doing. Haggai echoes that theme, or better yet, I echo Haggai's theme. So let's think about it in terms of these 4 messages. In Haggai chapter 1, the first message, what Haggai teaches us is that faith changes your priorities, right? What you talk about, what you spend your money on, how you spend your time, are all indicative of what you really think is most important. In the case of Haggai, what we see is the people have made bad investment choices. They've been back from captivity now 16 years, and they still haven't rebuilt the temple. It shows what a low priority their relationship with God really has in their lives. In fact, it says in verse 2, these people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. Not yet? If not now, when? And yet, we know from Haggai chapter 1, it says that they dwell in paneled houses. Now, today we make fun of paneling largely in the West, but back then, remember, their houses were made of mud bricks. Wood paneling would have meant you were wealthy. And so the people, rather than working on restoring the relationship with God, have invested their time and money in improving their physical situation. We're not talking about they didn't have houses to live in. We're talking about the fact that they lived in as nice a house as possible, while ignoring their spiritual life with God. The net result is, because they've invested in themselves physically and not spiritually, they're suffering physically. Verse 6 talks about this. It says, you've sown much and you've harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your full. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages does so to put them in bags with holes. And so, they're spending their money, their time, their lives on things of no eternal consequence. Haggai comes and he challenges them on this thing, points them out, tells them about what they're doing and what they need to do. And then strangely, surprisingly, beginning of verse 12, they listened. They obeyed. And they obeyed seemingly instantly, immediately. They obeyed God. They started building again. Pictures almost immediately. And in doing so, or in response to their doing so, God promised his presence to them. It says in verse 13, I am with you, declares the Lord. And so when we dedicate ourselves to our relationship with God, to make it a priority, God manifests himself in our lives in ways that is tangible, in ways that rewards us for our efforts. Not because he's responding to us as though he owes us, but he's showing us that what faith buys is a closer, more vital relationship with God. Think about how many times in your lives you spent your money or your time on things not spiritual when you could have been spending them on things more important. Think about how many times you've kept money for yourself rather than contributing to God. Imagine what it says when God's people spend no time in God's house, or as little as possible. And imagine what it says when God's people spend no money on God's priorities, on God's missions, on God's ministry. Instead, they spend all their money on things of temporary importance. What does that say about your spiritual life? Remember, what's our theme? Real faith makes a real difference. It changes everything. Chapter 2 tells us it changes your perspective. It changes how you see the world. This particular message takes place about 6 weeks after the first. They're making progress, but it's slow and it's disappointing. It's not what they'd hoped, right? At Doorway Baptist Church used to run over 1,000 in Sunday school. Now we're about 80 or 90 on a great Sunday, thanks to COVID and other issues. And there are days when we can't wait to see it better. But rather than rejoicing at 5 or 10 or 12 new members in our church, we lament that it's not more, that it's not what it used to be. But real faith changes your perspective. This is why in chapter 2, that is, verse 1, he calls on the people of Israel to count on God's promises. In fact, in verse 4, he says, "Be strong, O Zerubbabel. Be strong, O Joshua. Be strong, O people of the land." It's let your faith change your attitude. And what's the source of that change? Verse 5, "I'm with you again. I'm with you, declares the Lord of hosts, according to the covenant I made with you. My spirit remains in your midst." God has kept his word, and we need to remember that and live as though we believe that. When he says that I will never leave you or forsake you, when he promises in the New Testament that no one can snatch you out of his hands, that whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, all those promises ought to change how we approach life circumstances, the ups and the downs, the disappointments and the frustrations. Because when God says he's going to do something, he's going to do something. Now, sometimes it doesn't always feel like that, but remember, the future that we're promised is always better than the present we're living, even if the present is very good. Verse 6 of chapter 2 says, "I'll shake the heavens and the earth." Verse 7 says, "I'll shake the nations." Verse 7 also adds that I'll fill this house with glory. And the house is the temple. I'm going to fill the house with my glory. I'm going to reveal myself to you, manifest myself to you in such a way that our relationship will not only be real and vital, but you'll know it, you can sense it. In fact, he goes even further and he promises in verse 9, the latter days of this, or the latter glory of this house, will be greater than the former. So don't get hung up on the present circumstances. Think bigger. Let your faith control how you view everything. Because as he promises in verse 9, in this place I will give peace. And so real faith changes our perspective. And what we do is we wait faithfully, expectantly for God's blessings. And so they're 4 months into the project now as we get towards the end of chapter 2. The work is slow. The progress seems negligible. The blessings they were expecting seem to be slow in coming. Sin continues to abound, it tells us in verse 14 and following. What they offer is unclean. It yields nothing. But in verse 19, "But from this day on," God promises, "I will bless you." When we have real faith, we wait with expectation. It's like William Carey, the great Baptist missionary, said, we're to attempt great things for God, and we're to expect great things from God. And so faith changes everything. Lastly, as we get towards the end of chapter 2, we see that it also changes our response to what's going on around us. It changes how we respond to our circumstances. We begin by noticing there in verse 20 to 22 that what changes here is we recognize that the victory belongs to God. It's a vision that Haggai offers here. It's a vision of the day of the Lord, vision of the day of the judgment, when God is going to defeat the enemies. I'll shake the heavens and earth. I'll overthrow the kingdoms, or thrones of kingdoms in verse 22. I'm about to destroy the strength of kingdoms of nations, also in verse 22. It's God who's going to do all this. We're to respond in faith. And the faith is that with God, we believe anyway, that God will do these things he's promised. And so victory belongs to God. Most notably, victory belongs to the King of God. Verse 23 speaks of Zerubbabel. He's the governor of the people of Israel as they've gone back to Jerusalem. He's kind of, in one sense, the embodiment of their hope. He's a descendant of David. But he never actually becomes king. Thus, he's got to be something else. He's got to be more than the literal promise. He's the symbolic picture of the real promise. Because what happens with Zerubbabel is he disappears from the narrative entirely. We don't know what happened to him. We don't know if he ever got to see any of these things promised. Instead, we're looking for the real king. We're looking for the King Jesus, descendant of David. This is what Matthew and Luke's genealogies point out. They both mention David. Both take different ways of getting us to that point, but both overlap in their mention of Zerubbabel in their discussion of the lineage of the king. And it's going to be Christ who is the king, acts on God's behalf, that brings God's work to a conclusion. And our response is going to be to worship the king, to bring honor and glory to him, to recognize the king, to respond in worship, just as they began to do on that triumphal Sunday, on Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry, just as the criminal on the cross who called out to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And thus today, we still wait for the final revelation of the king, his final coming, to welcome him fully back to reign over all his creation, including us. Faith changes everything. How we respond with our money and our time, how we respond with our perspective, how we view the world, and how we respond to all these things with our worship. Is your faith real? Has it changed everything?